My fiancée left me after I invested everything in her business, but what happened next made her come crawling back. They say betrayal hits hardest when it comes from someone you gave everything to. I learned that lesson with a cinnamon roll in one hand and a broken heart in the other. So there I was, living what I thought was my best life in Asheville, North Carolina. You know those picture-perfect mountain towns where the air's so fresh it practically slaps you awake every morning? That was my world. The rolling hills covered in morning mist looked like something straight out of a Bob Ross painting. Except Bob never had to deal with chicken feed bills and a temperamental tractor that had more mood swings than a teenager. My farm wasn't much to look at. 43 acres of what the real estate lady generously called rustic charm. Translation: everything was held together with duct tape, prayer, and the stubborn will of Appalachian gravity. The pace of life out there was so slow that snails looked like they were training for NASCAR. Even our local sheriff, Deputy Williams, seemed to patrol just to make sure I hadn't fallen asleep at the wheel of my beat-up Ford pickup. I had this routine that kept me sane. Wake up at 5. Coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Check on the chickens who always acted like they were doing me a personal favor by laying eggs. Those birds had more attitude than most people I knew, and twice the honesty. My granddad Joe used to say that honest work and good intentions would see you through anything life threw at you. He'd built this farm with his own hands, raised my father here, and left me with more wisdom than money. His old violin case still sat in the attic, gathering dust, but somehow still filling the house with his presence. Granddad had been our town's Renaissance man. Could fix anything, build anything, and play music that could make grown men cry. Speaking of stubborn hope, I once bought this miracle tomato growth formula from a late-night infomercial. $49.99 plus shipping and handling later. I got a bottle of what was basically colored water with a fancy label. But did I throw it away? Hell no. I used every last drop, convincing myself I could see the difference. That's the thing about me. I've always been what Granddad Joe called optimistically gullible. But life was good. Simple, predictable, honest. The kind of good where your biggest worry is whether Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning rooster is going to jump your fence again and terrorize your hens. Then Sarah walked into Pete's Diner on a Tuesday that started like any other Tuesday, but ended up changing everything. She had these green eyes that seemed to hold all the depth of the Appalachian valleys. And when she smiled, it was like the sun breaking through morning fog. Her laugh could stop traffic. Not that we had much traffic in Asheville, but you get the idea. She was new in town, just moved from Charlotte with dreams of opening a bakery and making the world a sweeter place, one cupcake at a time. I fell harder than a tree in a hurricane. Sarah had this way of talking about desserts like they were poetry, describing the perfect cinnamon roll like other people talked about sunsets. She'd paint pictures with words about buttercream frosting and flaky pastry crusts, and I'd sit there like a lovesick fool, hanging on every syllable. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. Sarah was ambitious in a way that made my quiet farm life look like I was moving backwards through time. She'd talk about her bakery dreams with this fire in her eyes that I mistook for passion for baking. Really, it was just passion for success, for making something bigger than what life had handed her. 6 months after we started dating, I proposed to her right there on the front porch under a sky full of Carolina stars. She said yes with tears in her eyes and a smile that could have powered the whole county. We started planning our wedding, talking about kids running around the farm, maybe expanding the chicken coop into a proper operation. Sarah moved into the farmhouse, and for a few magical months, everything felt perfect. She'd wake up early to help with the morning chores, and I'd come in for lunch to find her experimenting with new recipes in my grandmother's old kitchen. We were building something real together. That's when I did something that seemed romantic at the time, but now feels about as smart as using gasoline to put out a fire. I sold 20 acres, the good bottomland that Granddad always said was worth its weight in gold. I sold my prize bull Ferdinand, who was basically family. Even Granddad's old Ford that ran like a dream despite being older than dirt. I liquidated my entire life savings and handed it over to Sarah like some kind of fairy godfather with a checkbook. It felt noble at the time. Now, it just feels naive. For the bakery, I told her, feeling like the hero in some romantic movie. For our future, for our wedding, for the life we're going to build together. Sarah's Sweets opened 3 months later in a prime spot downtown, with gleaming display cases, and the kind of professional ovens that cost more than my truck. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls drew people like moths to a flame. Business was booming from day one. For a while, everything was perfect. We were engaged, planning our wedding for following spring. Sarah would call me from the bakery every evening to tell me about her latest creations. How the lemon bars turned out just right. How Mrs. Peterson ordered 6 dozen cupcakes for her grandson's birthday. I'd listen to her voice bubbling over with excitement and think I was the luckiest man alive. I felt like I was living in one of those commercials where the happy couple builds their dream life together, complete with wedding plans and shared morning coffee. Sarah had even started talking about converting the old barn into a bigger bakery operation after we got married. Our future felt as solid as the mountains surrounding us. That's when Jason showed up. This guy had that polished look that screamed money and success, hair so perfectly styled it looked like it came with a warranty, teeth so white they probably glowed in the dark, and a handshake that felt like a business transaction. He claimed to be an investor looking to help small businesses reach their full potential. Sarah introduced him as someone who could take the bakery to the next level. He drove a BMW that was so shiny it hurt to look at directly, and he wore suits that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. When he shook my hand, I felt like he was calculating my net worth and finding it disappointingly low. "So you're the farmer," he said, like I was some kind of museum exhibit. His smile was the kind you see in toothpaste commercials. Technically perfect, but somehow completely empty. I should have trusted my gut right then. My gut was screaming that this guy was trouble with a capital T. But Sarah seemed so excited about the possibilities he was offering, and I didn't want to be the small-town boyfriend holding back her big-city dreams. The warning signs started small. Sarah's phone calls became shorter, more distracted. She was always rushing off to meetings that seemed to happen at odd hours and last well into the night. Her clothes started smelling different, too. Expensive cologne, and perfume that definitely wasn't hers. My chickens, bless their judgmental little hearts, seemed to see what I couldn't. Every time Sarah's car pulled up with that fancy BMW following behind, they'd start squawking like they were announcing the arrival of a fox in a henhouse. If they'd had picket signs, I swear those hens would have formed a union against Jason. Even my old dog Buster, who usually liked everyone, would growl low in his throat whenever Jason came around. Animals know things we don't, and mine were trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. But love makes you deaf to warning signs. I was so busy being proud of Sarah's success that I missed the fact that I was becoming a stranger in my own relationship. The end came on a Thursday evening in October. The leaves were turning that particular shade of gold that makes the mountains look like they're on fire, and I was feeling grateful for the life we'd built together. I'd picked up fresh flowers from Mrs. Chen's garden stand and stopped by the bakery to surprise Sarah with dinner plans. That's when I found them in the back office. Sarah and Jason, locked in an embrace that made it crystal clear this wasn't their first private meeting. The sound of my footsteps made them spring apart like teenagers caught sneaking out past curfew. The look on Sarah's face wasn't guilt or shame. It was annoyance, like I'd interrupted something important. "Arthur," she said, her voice calm as a lake before a storm, "we need to talk." Those 4 words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. My heart, which had been beating along just fine for 32 years, suddenly felt like it was trying to escape through my throat. The flowers in my hand seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. We drove home in silence. Sarah stared out the passenger window like she was memorizing the scenery for the last time. I kept hoping she'd say something to explain what I'd seen, some reasonable explanation that would make everything okay again. This was my fiancée, the woman I was supposed to marry in 6 months, the woman who'd been living in our home, planning our future. When we got to the farmhouse, our farmhouse, where we'd been planning our wedding, where she'd move her things into my grandmother's old dresser, Sarah turned to me with the kind of calm that comes before a tornado. She spoke like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed, each word precise and devastating. "I'm leaving, Arthur. Jason and I, we're taking the bakery to Atlanta. There are opportunities there that just don't exist in a place like this. She gestured around the kitchen where we'd shared so many meals, so many dreams, so many late-night conversations about our wedding plans and the children we'd hoped to raise here. The way she said, "a place like this," made it sound like she was trapped in some backwater prison instead of the home we'd been building together. "What about us?" I managed to ask, though the words came out like a croak. "What about our wedding? What about the life we've been building?" "There is no us, Arthur. There hasn't been for a while." She paused, and I noticed she wasn't wearing the engagement ring I'd saved up 3 months to buy. "Arthur, you still dream in miles when I need light years. You still think this porch is the edge of the world. I need more than fence lines and egg baskets." Those words cut deeper than any knife. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd given her, everything I thought we were building together, all of it was just too small for her grand vision. "I'll leave you the bakery equipment that won't fit in the truck," she continued, like she was doing me some kind of favor. "And I'm glad I never have to look at Grandpa Joe's old junk in the attic again. I don't know how you can stand keeping all that worthless clutter around." Grandpa Joe's junk. 20 years of memories, family heirlooms, pieces of our family history, all just worthless clutter to her. The contempt in her voice when she said it made my stomach turn. She'd been living in this house for months, walking past those boxes every day, and apparently hating every piece of my family's legacy. If Granddad could have heard her dismiss his life's work like that, his old violin would have played a funeral dirge. I watched her pack with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this for weeks. She moved through our shared life like she was checking items off a grocery list. The things she left behind told their own story. Photo albums we'd made together, little gifts I'd given her over the years, the coffee mug that said "World's Best Baker." When she finished packing, she walked through the house one last time, not with nostalgia or regret, but like a realtor doing a final walkthrough before closing. Her green eyes, which I'd once thought held all the depth of the mountains, now looked as cold as January fog. "I'm sorry it has to be this way," she said, though she didn't sound sorry at all. "You'll understand someday that this is better for both of us." Then she was gone, her car disappearing down the dirt road that led away from our life together. I stood on the porch watching until her taillights vanished around the bend, and then I stood there for another hour, hoping she might change her mind and come back. She didn't. The silence that followed was deafening. No more phone calls about successful baking experiments. No more excited chatter about customer compliments. No more plans for the future. Just me, 23 acres of land that suddenly felt like 400, and a farmhouse that echoed with memories of what used to be. That night, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee that tasted like regret and stared at the pile of boxes I'd always kept in the corner. Grandpa Joe's belongings that had been gathering dust since he passed. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who just called my family's legacy worthless clutter was gone, and here I was alone with the possessions of the one person who'd always understood me. Granddad Joe had been gone for 5 years, but his presence still filled this house. He'd built most of it with his own hands, raised my father here, taught me everything I knew about working the land and treating people with respect. His old violin case sat on top of the pile, like a crown on a treasure chest. Even in my grief, something about that violin case called to me. Granddad had always said that real music wasn't just sound. It was the whisper of history that only the heart could hear. Looking at his instrument, I felt that whisper calling to me across the years. I opened the case with trembling fingers. The violin lay there like a sleeping beauty, its wood still gleaming despite years of storage. Something about it seemed different from what I remembered, more intricate, more purposeful. My chickens, the most honest critics I've ever known, seemed to sense that something monumental had happened. They gathered around me like mourners at a funeral, clucking softly in what I chose to interpret as sympathy. Even they seemed to understand that this was bigger than just another bad day on the farm. As I sat there surrounded by the remnants of my old life and the mysterious promise of whatever came next, I remembered something Granddad Joe used to say. "Life's like a fence, Arthur. Sometimes you think you've climbed over it, only to find out it's leading you to an even bigger hole. But sometimes, if you're real lucky, that hole turns out to be a foundation for something better." I was definitely in a hole. The question was, would it bury me or become a foundation for something I couldn't even imagine yet? Looking back now, I can see that Thursday evening in October wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning disguised as a catastrophe, a door slamming shut so hard it rattled the windows of possibility I didn't even know existed. But that violin case sitting there in the lamplight seemed to whisper a different story. A story about second chances and hidden treasures, and the kind of magic that happens when you least expect it. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones other people call junk. Sometimes the best chapters of your story start with the worst days of your life. And sometimes, when you've lost everything you thought mattered, you discover something that matters more. I still didn't know that this pile of junk would become my ticket to a new life, a whole symphony of possibilities waiting to be discovered, or that unlocking its secrets would require me to dive deep into the mysteries of my eccentric grandfather, mysteries I never even suspected existed. The days that followed crawl by like molasses in January, slow, thick, and painful as hell. I felt like a blown-out tire on the side of Route 66. Not just forgotten, but actively avoided by everyone smart enough to keep moving. Granddad Joe used to say that old trees could still bear new fruit, but right then, I felt more like a dead stump ready for the wood chipper. Even my morning coffee tasted like disappointment. The chickens seemed to sense my misery and started laying eggs with an attitude, like they were doing me some kind of reluctant favor. My old dog Buster would just look at me with those wise brown eyes that seemed to say, "Well, Arthur, you really stepped in it this time, didn't you?" I'd sit in Granddad's old recliner for hours, staring at that violin case like it might suddenly start talking and explain where my life had gone wrong. The house still smelled faintly of Sarah's perfume, which was about as welcome as a skunk at a garden party. I kept expecting to hear her car in the driveway, kept thinking maybe she'd realize what a mistake she'd made. She didn't. The silence in that house was so thick, you could cut it with a butter knife. No more excited phone calls about successful pastry experiments. No more chatter about expanding the business. Just me, 23 acres of land that suddenly felt like the whole state of Montana, and a farmhouse that echoed with the ghosts of plans that would never happen. It was during one of these marathon pity parties that something interesting happened. I was holding Granddad's violin, turning it over my hands like some kind of worry stone, when my pinky finger, which up until that moment had been pretty much useless except for scratching my ear, caught on a tiny bump near one of the tuning pegs. Click. Just like that, a little panel I'd never noticed before popped open. Hidden compartment. This thing was so well concealed that even I, who'd known Granddad Joe since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, had never spotted it. The old man always did say that the biggest secrets hide in plain sight. You just have to be paying attention. Inside that secret compartment was a yellowed piece of paper covered in Granddad's handwriting. And let me tell you, that man's penmanship made doctor prescriptions look like calligraphy. There was also a small, old-fashioned map with strange markings that looked like they belonged in a pirate movie. The note was classic Granddad Joe, mysterious as a David Lynch film and twice as confusing. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the note, not sure if I was supposed to laugh, cry, or salute the damn thing. It was pure Granddad, cryptic, dramatic, and oddly comforting. It read something like, "Arthur, this violin is my most precious treasure. She remembers the voice of music, even when I no longer can. But she has a secret, boy, a secret hidden in her very heart. This isn't just a copy. It's an unfinished masterpiece waiting for its craftsman. Find the true story of the Stradivarius. Not the one in books, but the one whispered by her wood. And you'll understand that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't gold, but what plays on the strings of your soul." My heart started beating faster than a rabbit running from a coyote. Granddad had always been an enigma wrapped in overalls and topped with John Deere cap. But this was different. This was like finding a treasure map in your grandmother's recipe box, except the treasure wasn't cookies. It was something that could change everything. I read that note about 6 times before it really sank in. An unfinished masterpiece? The true story of the Stradivarius? I felt like the main character in some adventure movie, except instead of being played by Harrison Ford, I was being played by a heartbroken farmer who couldn't tell a violin from a fiddle without looking up on Google. But something about that note lit a fire in me that had been stone cold since Sarah walked out. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than self-pity and regret. Now, I hadn't been in the Asheville Public Library since I was looking up how to make the perfect apple pie, and that was back when Bill Gates was still figuring out what to do with Windows. The smell of old books and forgotten knowledge hit me like a wave of nostalgia mixed with dust, and that particular odor of places where dreams go to get cataloged. The librarian, a stern-looking lady with glasses that could probably start fires on a cloudy day, watched me approach the card catalog like I was an alien who just landed and was trying to figure out Earth customs. She clearly wasn't used to seeing farmers wandering around asking about the real history of Stradivarius. I had to make up some story about a school project, which earned me a suspicious look that suggested she knew damn well I hadn't been in school since the Clinton administration. But I persisted, diving into dusty volumes about violin making. I hadn't been that confused since trying to assemble a grill from Walmart without the manual. But I kept at it, learning more about varnish formulas and with grain patterns than any sane person should know. That's when I started thinking about Granddad Joe's workshop. The man had been what you might generously call an eccentric. He'd spend hours out there like some kind of woodworking alchemist, turning ordinary lumber into what we thought was just furniture and decorations. His workshop always smelled like sawdust, varnish, and something mysterious, like he was brewing potions for immortality or the perfect sound. The rest of the family just figured he was keeping busy in his retirement. Nobody questioned what old Joe was really up to out there. Now I was starting to wonder if there was more to his hobby than anyone realized. Armed with my newfound violin knowledge and a head full of questions, I started going through Granddad's workshop notes. The man had kept journals that were part diary, part technical manual, and part philosophical rambling. His handwriting looked like spider tracks in wet cement, but gradually I started making sense of his strange notations. There were diagrams that looked like musical notes mixed with engineering blueprints, sketches of violin parts with measurements written in some kind of code, references to the Sleeping Beauty, and completing what was started centuries ago. It was like trying to decode the Da Vinci Code, except instead of religious mysteries, it was all about wood and strings and the science of making beautiful sounds. I needed help, and I knew exactly where to get it. Henry's music shop sat on Main Street, like it had been there since before electricity was invented. The place was run by Henry Morrison, who'd been Granddad's best friend and probably the only person in 3 counties who understood what the old man had been up to all those years. Henry was one of those guys who seemed to have been born old and wise. His fingers were permanently stained with rosin, and his eyes held the kind of knowledge that comes from a lifetime of making instruments sing. When I walked in carrying Granddad's violin case, Henry's expression shifted from casual welcome to something approaching awe. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared. Then, well, I'll be damned, Joe's mystery fiddle. I never thought I'd see it again. That phrase, mystery fiddle, sent a chill down my spine. Henry's reaction when I opened the case was something to behold. His weathered hands actually trembled as he reached toward the instrument, then stopped just short of touching it, like he was approaching something sacred. "Your granddad found this old girl in Europe after the war," Henry said, his voice taking on that reverent tone people use in churches. "She was damaged, practically in pieces, but Joe saw something in her that nobody else could see, like looking at a cracked diamond and seeing the hope diamond inside." He told me how Granddad had become obsessed with this violin, not just fixing it, but understanding it, researching its history, studying old techniques, spending every spare moment trying to unlock what he called her true voice. "Joe believed this wasn't just any old violin," Henry continued, circling around the instrument like it might suddenly sprout wings. He thought it was something special. Maybe an unfinished instrument from Stradivari's workshop. Maybe something created from his original designs that never got completed. Joe used to say it whispered secrets to him, begged him to finish what someone started centuries ago. The pieces were starting to come together. Granddad hadn't just been tinkering in his workshop. He'd been on a mission, a quest to restore something extraordinary that most people would have thrown away as firewood. "But here's the thing, Arthur," Henry said, lowering his voice like he was sharing state secrets. "Joe never finished the job. He got close, real close, but then his arthritis got too bad and his eyesight started failing. My heart was beating so hard, I thought it might echo off the shop walls. The day before he passed, he made me promise something. He made me promise that if anyone came asking about this violin, if anyone showed up carrying her and asking the right questions, I'd tell them the truth. Joe said the right person would know what to do with her. Someone who needed her as much as she needed to be completed. Henry spent the next hour showing me Granddad's research. Photocopies of centuries-old documents. Diagrams of Stradivarius techniques that supposedly had been lost to time. Chemical analyses of varnish formulas that read like ancient recipes for liquid magic. Your granddad wasn't just restoring this violin, Henry explained. He was bringing her back to life using knowledge that most people thought was gone forever. He'd found a way to recreate the sound of the golden age of violin making, maybe even improve on it. The more Henry talked, the more I understood that what I was holding wasn't just a musical instrument. It was like holding a piece of history that had been waiting centuries for the right person to complete it. And somehow, through the cosmic joke that is life, that person might be me, a farmer who couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. But here's what you need to understand, Arthur, Henry said, his eyes getting that faraway look of someone remembering better times. This isn't just about restoration anymore. Joe left instructions, hidden in his workshop notes. He figured out the final steps, the last pieces of the puzzle, but he never got to implement them. Henry pulled out a small notebook from behind the counter. He held it like it was made of glass, then placed it in my hands like passing a torch in some ancient ritual. It wasn't heavy, but somehow it shook me to my core. Joe left this for whoever came looking. Said it contained everything needed to finish what he started. The techniques, the measurements, even the specific type of what needed for the final adjustments. I stared at that notebook like it was the Holy Grail. In a way, maybe it was. But I have to warn you, Henry continued. What Joe was trying to do, completing a centuries-old masterpiece using lost techniques. It's like trying to fix a Rolex with a hammer and duct tape. Not exactly beginner's work. I left Henry's shop with my head spinning, and my heart racing for the first time since Sarah had walked out. The notebook felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds and nothing at all simultaneously. I had a purpose again, a quest, a reason to get up in the morning that didn't involve feeding chickens and feeling sorry for myself. Driving home to the Carolina mountains, with Granddad's violin case in the passenger seat and Henry's warnings echoing in my head, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of wanting Sarah to come back, but real, solid hope based on something I could actually control. The violin seemed to hum with possibility, even sitting silent in its case, like it was as eager as I was to discover what secrets it held. That evening, I spread Granddad's workshop notes across my kitchen table, like I was planning a military campaign. The diagrams and measurements that looked like gibberish before were starting to make sense, like a foreign language I was finally beginning to understand. The more I studied those notes, the clearer it became that Granddad Joe had been operating on a completely different level than anyone realized. This wasn't just a hobby or a way to pass time in retirement. This was serious, scholarly, potentially world-changing work disguised as an old man's tinkering. I could almost hear his voice in those carefully written instructions. Arthur, sometimes the most important work looks like playing around with folks who don't understand what they're seeing. As I sat there surrounded by centuries-old secrets in my granddad's life work, I realized something profound had shifted. Just days ago, I'd been a broken man whose fiancée had called his dreams too small. Now I was the keeper of a mystery that could reshape the musical world. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah had walked away from what she saw as a small, limited life, but she'd left behind what might turn out to be one of the most significant discoveries in violin making history. Talk about not knowing what you're walking away from. I traced the violin's curves like reading Braille from the past, searching for something I didn't yet have the words for. For the first time since Sarah left, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, holding exactly what I was meant to hold. The violin felt warm in my hands, like it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to care enough to finish what had been started so long ago. Granddad's voice seemed to whisper from beyond. Well, Arthur, you ready to do something that matters? You ready to bring some real music back into this world? I was ready. I didn't know the first thing about violin restoration or centuries-old craftsmanship techniques, but I was ready to learn, ready to honor Granddad's legacy and maybe, just maybe, create something extraordinary in the process. With the violin in my hands and Granddad Joe's mystery unfolding before me, I understood that my life was just beginning. But to unlock this secret, I'd need to do something I'd never done before. Learn to hear what this instrument was trying to tell me. I had no idea how strange that journey would turn out to be, or what it would mean for a simple farmer to try becoming a craftsman. But I was about to find out. What followed were weeks of the most exhausting, frustrating, and strangely satisfying work I'd ever done. My hands, which were more comfortable holding a shovel than a precision tool, kept fumbling with delicate violin parts like I was trying to perform surgery with oven mitts. I'd catch myself calling the soundboard a lid and the ribs those curved thingies, which would have made any real violin maker weep into their morning coffee. I even tried sanding down a section with sandpaper once. Nearly turned that centuries-old masterpiece into the world's most expensive kindling. That would have been one hell of a way to explain myself to Granddad's ghost. My neighbor's cats seemed to have formed their own Arthur watching club, perching on my windowsills like furry critics, observing the crazy farmer guy who spent hours muttering over bits of wood and tiny metal parts. They'd sit there with that judgmental cat expression that clearly said, "This fool has finally lost it." I tried everything. Wood glue, furniture polish, even shoe repair adhesive in a moment of desperation. Thankfully stopped myself before that disaster. It was like some weird meditation where the wood was the guru, and I was a confused student who kept asking the wrong questions. But slowly, painfully, things started making sense. Granddad's notes began reading less like ancient hieroglyphics and more like a roadmap to something extraordinary. The breakthrough came during one of those 3 a.m. sessions when exhaustion makes you either brilliant or completely insane. I was staring at Granddad's diagram of the internal sound post placement when it hit me like a lightning bolt to the brain. He hadn't just been restoring this violin. He'd been completing it using techniques that were supposedly lost to history. Granddad had figured out how to recreate the exact acoustical properties that made Stradivarius violins legendary. He'd found a way to unlock what he called the voice sleeping in the wood. This wasn't just restoration work. This was like finding the recipe for Coca-Cola written in Leonardo da Vinci's notebook. The old man had embedded secrets into this violin that enhanced its sound in ways that modern science was still trying to understand. Knowledge he collected over decades, piece by precious piece, like assembling a jigsaw puzzle made of pure music. This wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a living artifact that held the whispers of centuries, memories of musicians who'd held it, stories it had heard. Granddad hadn't just restored it. He completed something that had been waiting hundreds of years for the right person to finish what anonymous craftsmen had started. Every adjustment I made felt like I was having a conversation with the past, that would seem to respond to my touch, guiding me toward the right techniques. It sounds crazy, but I swear that violin was teaching me how to heal it. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. My chickens started giving me the stink because I was forgetting to feed them on time. Buster would bring his food bowl to the workshop and drop it at my feet with the canine equivalent of an eye roll. But something magical was happening. With each careful adjustment, each precisely placed component, the violin was coming alive under my hands. The sound was getting richer, deeper, more complex, like I was slowly turning up the volume on something that had been playing softly in another room for centuries. When I finally decided I needed to learn to actually play the thing, there was only one logical choice. Henry Morrison had been Granddad's best friend and the only musician in 3 counties who understood what we were dealing with. Henry had those wise eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul, and hands that could make any instrument sing like an angel. When I showed up at his shop, carrying the violin and asking for lessons, his reaction was priceless. "Well, Arthur," he said, looking at me like I had just announced my intention to climb Mount Everest in flip-flops, I've seen some ambitious students in my day, but you're starting with a violin that most professionals would be afraid to breathe on, let alone play. But when he saw how serious I was and how much work I'd already put into understanding the instrument, something shifted in his expression. He agreed to teach me, with one condition. I had a promise to treat this like it was the most important thing I'd ever do. Music isn't just fingers on strings, Arthur. Henry told me during our first lesson. It's the language of the soul. This violin has been waiting longer than either of us has been alive to tell its story. You're going to be its voice. Those first lessons were humbling, to put it mildly. I'd hold the bow like I was gripping a hammer, pressing down so hard that the strings sounded like they were being tortured. Henry would wince and gently adjust my grip for the 100th time, explaining that playing violin was more like convincing the instrument to cooperate than forcing it to obey. Pretend you're petting a cat that might scratch you if you're too rough, he'd say. The violin wants to make beautiful music. Your job is just to get out of its way. Slowly, incredibly slowly, I started to understand. Each practice session was like having a conversation with Granddad Joe, feeling his presence guide my fingers. Hear his voice and the careful instructions he'd left behind. Henry told me stories about the old days, when Granddad had been the best musician in Asheville, how he'd play country blues in the local coffee shops until his arthritis got too bad and his hearing started to fade. But even then, even when he couldn't perform anymore, he'd never stopped believing in the power of music to heal and transform. Joe had this ritual, Henry explained during one of our sessions, his eyes getting that distant look of remembering. Every morning, he'd spend an hour in his workshop before doing anything else, not working on the violin, just sitting with it, listening. He said the wood would tell him what it needed that day. Granddad's dedication had been legendary around town. People thought he was just an eccentric old man who liked to tinker, but Henry knew better. Joe would drive 3 hours to find a specific type of varnish, or spend his pension money on rare books about 17th century Italian craftsmanship. Your granddad once told me something that gave me chills, Henry continued, carefully adjusting my bow grip. He said this violin had been played by someone important, someone whose music was lost to history. Joe could feel their presence in the wood, like an echo that never quite faded away. The more Henry talked, the more I understood that Granddad's work hadn't been just about restoration. It had been about resurrection, bringing back not just the instrument, but the voice of whoever had played it centuries ago. Henry even told me about the time Granddad traded his prized fishing rod, a custom-made beauty he'd treasured for 30 years, for a piece of rare alpine spruce that he needed for the violin soundboard. Fish are temporary, Arthur, Joe had told him, but music lives forever in the wood. As weeks passed, something incredible started happening. Every note I played, every clumsy attempt at a melody, every small victory over my complete lack of musical experience. I felt connected to Granddad through the music, like he was standing right beside me, guiding my bow hand, encouraging me when I wanted to give up. This wasn't just learning to play an instrument. This was learning to speak a language that connected me to something larger than myself. Learning to find harmony even in chaos, to hear voices from the past speaking through vibrating strings. I felt the music filling the emptiness that Sarah had left behind, and it was so much better than any bakery smell or promises of shared futures. This was real. This was mine. This belonged to something bigger than petty human drama. The violin seemed to come alive in my hands, responding to my touch like it recognized something familiar. Every practice session brought new discoveries, subtle changes in tone, hidden depths of sound that revealed themselves only when I played with the right combination of pressure and emotion. I started understanding why Granddad had been so obsessed. This wasn't just about making music. It was about completing something that had been waiting centuries for the right person to finish it. Every note I played was part of a conversation that had been going on longer than America had been a country. Henry would watch me practice with this strange expression, like he was seeing a ghost. "You know, Arthur," he said one afternoon, "you're starting to hold that bow the same way Joe did. Some things skip generations, I guess." The transformation wasn't just in the violin. It was in me, too. For the first time since Sarah had walked out, I felt like I had a purpose that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or ambition. This was something I was building with my own hands, creating with my own dedication. Every evening, I'd sit on my front porch as the sun set behind the Carolina mountains, playing simple melodies that grew more complex as my fingers learned to trust the strings. The chickens would actually quiet down during these sessions, like even they could sense something special was happening. My old dog Buster would lie at my feet, occasionally thumping his tail when I hit a particularly sweet note. For a mutt who usually only got excited about dinner time and squirrels, this was high praise indeed. The sound that came from that violin was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Rich, complex, full of layers that seemed to tell stories from different centuries all at once. It wasn't just music. It was history speaking through wood and strings, generations of craftsmanship, and love poured into something that transcended its physical form. I began to understand what Granddad meant when he said that real music was the whisper of history that only the heart could hear. Every time I drew the bow across those strings, I was having a conversation with masters who'd been dead for hundreds of years. The violin seemed to be teaching me as much as Henry was, showing me where to place my fingers, how much pressure to apply, when to let the notes breathe and when to push them forward, like it was as eager as I was to finally fulfill its purpose. As I got better, and by better, I mean I progressed from sound like a dying cat to might actually be music if you squint your ears, I started feeling something I hadn't experienced since before Sarah left. Hope, not the desperate, clinging kind of hope that wants someone to come back, but solid, self-reliant hope based on something I was building with my own hands. Every small victory felt monumental. The first time I played a simple melody without Henry wincing. The first time the violin sang instead of shrieked. The first time I felt like I was making music instead of just noise. I was creating something beautiful, and nobody could take that away from me. Nobody could call it small or limited or not good enough. This was mine, built from scratch, earned through callous fingers and countless hours of practice. Henry started talking about the upcoming folk music festival in town. "You know, Arthur," he said one afternoon, "there's going to be an open mic night. Nothing fancy, just local folks sharing their music. Might be nice for you to play something." The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Me, playing in public? The guy who 6 months ago couldn't tell a violin from a ukulele? But something about the suggestion felt right, like this was a natural next step in whatever journey I'd started. I don't know if I'm ready for that, I told Henry, but even as I said it, I could feel something stirring in my chest, a desire to share what Granddad and I had built together. "Arthur," Henry said, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief, "you're holding a piece of history in your hands. Don't you think it deserves to be heard?" That night, I sat in my kitchen with the violin case open beside me, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Sarah's betrayal, finding Granddad's note, learning about the violin's true nature, spending weeks bringing it back to life. It felt like all of it had been leading to something bigger. I wasn't the same man who'd been left heartbroken and empty-handed 6 months ago. That guy had defined himself by other people's expectations and dreams. This version of me was building something that mattered, something that would outlast any relationship or business venture. The violin gleamed in the lamplight, patient and ready, like it had been waiting its whole existence for this moment, for someone who would care enough to complete what had been started so long ago. I picked up the bow and played a simple melody. Nothing fancy, just something that felt right in that moment. The sound filled my kitchen, warm and rich and full of promise. It sounded like hope. It sounded like second chances. It sounded like the best kind of revenge, the kind where you don't get back at someone, you just get so much better that their opinion stops mattering. For the first time since Sarah left, I felt genuinely excited about the future. Not because I was trying to win someone back or prove something to anyone else, but because I'd found something that was entirely mine, something that connected me to my granddad, to history, to the kind of legacy that actually matters. The folk music festival was coming up, and I was starting to think Henry might be right. Maybe it was time for this violin to tell its story to the world. I didn't know that my decision to perform would change not just my life, but the entire music world. I had no idea that this violin, granddad's junk, that Sarah had dismissed so contemptuously, was about to reveal secrets that would unlock a mystery centuries in the making. But I was ready to take the risk. After all, what did I have to lose? I'd already lost everything that I thought mattered. Now I was about to discover what actually did matter, and it was going to be extraordinary. The night of the folk festival, my knees were shaking like aspen leaves in a Carolina mountain wind. But somehow my hands seemed to have their own memory, like Granddad himself was guiding them. When I picked up that violin, I felt it pulse with life, like a tiny heart beating against my chest. A strange calm washed over me then, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The farm, the betrayal, the despair, the discovery. This was my second chance, and I wasn't about to blow it. The open mic stage at the Asheville Folk Festival wasn't much to look at. Just a few hay bales for seating, and a microphone that looked older than my pickup truck. But when I walked up there carrying Granddad's violin case, something in the air shifted. People who'd been chatting and drinking beer suddenly got quiet. When I opened that case, the violin gleamed under the stage lights like it was made of liquid gold. I could hear Henry in the crowd somewhere, probably holding his breath and praying I wouldn't embarrass myself. Or worse, damage a priceless piece of history in front of half the county. I positioned the violin under my chin, raised a bow, and for just a moment, I panicked. What if I had been kidding myself? What if months of practice had just made me a slightly better beginner? What if this whole thing was just a delusion of a heartbroken farmer who'd watched too many inspirational movies? Then I drew the bow across the strings, and something extraordinary happened. The sound that emerged was different from anything I'd achieved during practice. Richer, deeper, more alive than ever before. It was like the violin had been holding back during our private sessions, waiting for this moment to reveal its true voice. The acoustics of the outdoor stage, the energy of the crowd, the significance of the moment. Everything combined to unlock something I'd never heard before, even from the same instrument. It wasn't just music. It was storytelling. It was history speaking through wood and strings in a way that made my months of practice sound like whispers compared to this magnificent roar. The effect on the crowd was immediate and profound. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the birds in the trees seemed to quiet down, like they didn't want to miss a single note. My old dog Buster, who'd followed me to the festival and usually barked at everything that moved, lay down at the edge of the stage and closed his eyes, like he was listening to the world's most beautiful lullaby. I watched faces in the crowd transform. These were mountain folks who'd heard plenty of good music in their lives. But something about this sound was different, transcendent. I could see it in their eyes. They were hearing something they'd never experienced before, something that reached past their ears and grabbed their souls. The melody I played was simple, nothing fancy. Just something that felt right in that moment. Something that seemed to flow from the violin itself. But the way it sounded, rich, complex, layered with centuries of history, made it feel like the most important song ever played. That's when I noticed him. Sitting in the back, partially hidden by shadows, was a man who clearly didn't belong at a small-town folk festival. Expensive suit, perfectly groomed. The kind of guy who probably had a driver waiting in a luxury car somewhere. He was leaning forward in his seat, his mouth slightly open, staring at me like I'd just performed actual magic. Later, I'd learned this was Marcus Edwards, one of the most respected musical instrument collectors in the world. Guy who could tell the difference between a masterpiece and a masterful copy just by listening. He'd driven down from New York for a weekend getaway, expecting maybe some decent bluegrass and good barbecue. Instead, he'd stumbled onto what he'd later call the musical discovery of the decade. His reaction was everything I needed to know that this wasn't just my imagination. When someone who's made a career out of evaluating rare instruments looks like he's seen a ghost, you know you're holding something special. When I finished playing, the silence stretched what felt like an eternity. Then the applause started, not the polite clapping you get at most performances, but the kind of thunderous, sustained ovation that makes the ground shake. People were on their feet, some wiping tears from their eyes, others just shaking their heads in amazement. Before I could even set the violin down, Edwards was pushing through the crowd toward the stage. His usual composure, The kind of practice indifference that comes from years of evaluating priceless artifacts had completely evaporated. He looked like a kid who'd just seen Santa Claus. "Young man," he said, slightly out of breath from his rush to reach me. "What you're holding there isn't just an instrument. It's a miracle. I need to know everything about that violin, its history, its construction, its provenance. I'm prepared to pay whatever it takes to examine it properly." The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, appointments, and expert evaluations. Edwards brought in specialists from around the world, with analysis experts, acoustic engineers, historians who'd spent their lives studying Stradivarius and his contemporaries. They descended on my little farm like scientists investigating an alien landing. The results were beyond anything I could have imagined. Using electron microscopy, chemical analysis, and acoustic modeling, they confirmed what Granddad Joe had somehow known all along. This wasn't just a restored violin. It was a completed masterpiece, finished using techniques and knowledge that had been lost to history for centuries. "What your grandfather accomplished here," Edwards explained, his voice filled with something approaching reverence, "is nothing short of miraculous. He didn't just repair this instrument. He completed it using methods that scholars have been trying to rediscover for generations." The violin had indeed been created using original Stradivarius designs, likely from his workshop during the golden period of violin making. But it had never been finished until Granddad Joe found it and spent decades figuring out how to complete what the master had started. The result was an instrument that sounded like the legendary Stradivarius violins, but with refinements and improvements that even the original master hadn't achieved. It's like finding a lost symphony by Mozart. One expert told a gathering of reporters who'd started showing up at my farm. Except instead of just discovering it, someone actually completed it using Mozart's own techniques and intentions. They christened it the Resurrected Stradivarius. And within a week, the story had spread across the international music community like wildfire. Suddenly, my quiet farm was the center of a media storm, with reporters, musicians, and collectors from around the world wanting to hear the violin that had revolutionized our understanding of classical instrument making. Sotheby's contacted me within 2 weeks. The most prestigious auction house in the world wanted to handle the sale of what they called the most significant musical instrument discovery of the 21st century. They flew a team down from New York, including their top specialist and photographer who spent an entire day capturing every angle of the violin like it was the Mona Lisa. Mr. Jameson, the lead appraiser, told me, "Based on our preliminary evaluation, we believe this instrument could fetch anywhere from $10 to $20 million at auction, possibly more, depending on how aggressively collectors bid." $10 to $20 million. I had to sit down. 6 months ago, I'd been a farmer whose biggest financial worry was whether I could afford new chicken feed. Now I was looking at becoming one of the wealthiest people in North Carolina, all because of something Sarah had dismissed as worthless junk. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd left me because my dreams were too small had walked away from what turned out to be one of the most valuable musical instruments in existence. Talk about not knowing what you're walking away from. But as the weeks passed and the auction date approached, I realized something important. This wasn't really about the money. Sure, financial security was nice, but what mattered more was what I discovered about myself in the process. I'd found something I was passionate about, something that connected me to my granddad, and to something larger than myself. I'd learned to play music, not just technically, but emotionally. I'd learned to hear the stories that instruments wanted to tell, to feel the history embedded in wood and strings. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones other people overlook. The auction at Sotheby's was like something out of a movie. The room was filled with collectors, musicians, and investors from around the world, bidding open at $5 million, and climbed steadily from there. I sat in the back, watching these impossibly wealthy people compete for something that had been gathering dust in my attic for years. When the hammer finally came down, the resurrected Stradivarius had sold for $15 million. $15 million. To a private collector who planned to loan it to the New York Philharmonic, so the world could continue to hear its extraordinary voice. I walked out of that auction house a millionaire many times over, but more importantly, I walked out as someone who discovered his purpose. The money was nice, But the real treasure was what I'd learned about music, about family legacy, about finding meaning in unexpected places. I used the money to transform my farm into something I never could have imagined. Instead of growing tomatoes and raising chickens, I created the Joe Jameson Center for Musical Arts, a place where young musicians could come to learn, practice, and maybe discover their own hidden talents. We renovated the old barn into a state-of-the-art recording studio. The farmhouse became a residence for visiting artists and music students. The fields where I used to grow crops became outdoor performance spaces where the Carolina mountains provided the perfect backdrop for concerts under the stars. It felt like the right way to honor Granddad's memory, not by keeping his discovery to myself, but by sharing the magic of music with others. Every young violinist who picked up their first bow, every songwriter who found their voice in our studios, every audience member who felt their heart skip a beat during a perfect performance. They were all part of Granddad's legacy now. Of course, success has a way of bringing people out of the woodwork. About 6 months after the auction, Sarah showed up at my door. At first, I thought she was an Amazon delivery driver. She was dressed down, driving an old Honda that had seen better days, looking nothing like the confident woman who'd walked out on me. But it was definitely her. Older, more tired, but unmistakably the woman who'd once called my life too small for her ambitions. "Hello, Arthur," she said, and I could hear the rehearsed quality in her voice, like she'd practiced this conversation a dozen times. "I heard about everything, about the violin, the auction, what you've built here. I wanted to congratulate you." It turns out Jason hadn't been the successful businessman he pretended to be. He'd strung Sarah along just long enough to gain access to her accounts, then disappeared with everything she had. The bakery had gone bankrupt, she'd lost her house, and she was basically starting over from nothing. "I made a mistake, Arthur," she said, and I could see her working up to what she really wanted to say. "I thought I needed something bigger, more exciting. But what I really needed was someone who cared about building something meaningful. Someone like you." She talked about our wonderful years together, conveniently forgetting how she described them as limiting and small just months earlier. She mentioned how I used to sing to her while I worked in the garden, how she'd always thought I had a gentle soul. It was like listening to someone rewrite history in real time. But here's the thing, I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't even tempted. Looking at Sarah, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Not cruel pity, but genuine sadness for someone who'd spent so much time chasing the wrong things that she'd missed what was right in front of her. "Sarah," I said calmly, "I appreciate you coming by, and I'm sorry things didn't work out the way you hoped. But I'm not the same person I was when you left. I don't need your approval anymore, and I don't need you to validate my choices." I gestured toward the music center, where the sound of a student orchestra practicing drifted across the evening air. "You were right about one thing. The life I was living before was too small. But not because it wasn't ambitious enough. It was too small because I was trying to build it around someone else's dreams instead of my own. You call Granddad's violin worthless junk," I continued, "and maybe for you it was. But for me, it became the key to everything I never knew I wanted. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones other people can't see the worth in." Sarah stood there for a moment, probably hoping I'd invite her in, offer her a second chance, maybe even share in the wealth I'd found. But those days were over. I'd learned too much about myself, about what really mattered, to go backward. "I wish you the best, Sarah," I said, and meant it. "I hope you find what you're really looking for." She left, and I felt nothing but relief. Not the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet contentment of someone who'd finally learned the difference between being alone and being free. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the Carolina mountains in shades of gold and purple. From the music center came the sound of a young violinist practicing scales, each note clear and determined. A group of songwriters was gathered around a guitar on the lawn, working through a melody that might become something beautiful. This was my symphony now. Not the grand, dramatic composition I'd once imagined my life would be, but something richer and more complex. A harmony built from loss and discovery, from heritage and innovation, from the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful. Granddad Joe always said that life was like a melody. Sometimes it sounds off-key, but you can always find a new harmony if you listen to your heart. Sitting there surrounded by music and possibility, I understood what he meant. Sometimes you have to lose everything you think you want to discover what you actually need. Sometimes you have to walk through the deepest valleys to appreciate the view from the mountaintop. Sometimes the most precious treasures are hidden in what other people dismiss as junk. Real value isn't measured in dollars or status or other people's opinions. It's measured in the legacy you leave, the joy you create, the connections you forge. As Mark Twain once said, good friends, good books, and a sleepy conscience. This is the ideal life. I'd add one more thing to that list. An old violin with a soul. The resurrected Stradivarius had given me more than financial security. It had given me purpose, connection to my grandfather, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that happen when you're not looking for them. My story wasn't ending. It was just changing key. The music center was growing, bringing talented young artists from around the world to study in the shadow of the Carolina mountains. Every day brought new melodies, new voices, new possibilities. I'd learned that the best revenge isn't getting back at someone who hurt you. It's becoming so genuinely happy that their opinion stops mattering. I'd learned that success isn't about proving other people wrong. It's about proving yourself right. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as junk in your grandfather's attic, waiting for someone who cares enough to see their true value. The real music of life never ends. It just changes tempo, finds new harmonies, and reminds you that every ending is really just a new beginning in disguise. And this was my new beginning, and it sounded absolutely perfect.